And I'd like you to have a quick look at a very short film, which was made by David Castello-Lopez, who is here. And perhaps if you'd like to say a word, we'll cut the film by 1 minute for each minute that you speak. You have at least 30 seconds, speaking time here. Let me just introduce David Castello-Lopez, who will be presenting you his film very briefly. So I'm called David Castello-Lopez. I'm a journalist at Canal+. I have a program called Chiffroscope, and my job is to find the most innovative ways possible to explain complicated things in a simple way. And I've applied this to the economy of culture through the history of a character who three banal things happen to, but each one of them is an economic argument in favor of public funding for culture. I did this together with Leonard Cohen, who is a well-known cartoonist.
C'est le 15 août aux Tuileries à Paris.
August 15th on the Tuileries in Paris. It's 12:30. And on a seat with children chasing one another, and you're terribly thirsty. You walk to the refreshment stand in the nearby Concorde Square, and you start ordering lemonades, one by one. The first of one just fills you with unspeakable delight. The second is a little less enjoyable, and the third saturates you with sugar to the point that you have to stop drinking. Without knowing it, you've just demonstrated a fundamental law of economics called the principle of diminishing marginal utility. The more you consume a good, the less pleasure you will get from it. This applies to all categories of goods. Well, almost. Because a few yards from where you're standing, a string quartet is playing a piece by Schubert. You know nothing about classical music, but you know this piece because a music teacher had you listen to it back in junior high. As you walk closer to the band, you recognize the trills.
L'expérience de Schubert vous...
It so moved you back then. And as you walk, it will bring you even more joy when you listen to it for a third time, and Schubert will perhaps make you enjoy Beethoven, who in turn will lead you to Brahms. So you put 10 euros in the cello case, and you take a copy of the quartet CD. Music and other cultural goods are the exceptions to the rule of diminishing marginal utility. The more music you listen to, the more books you read, the more museums you visit, the greater the satisfaction you get out of them. But it all has to begin somewhere. In this case, it is the state that kicked off the process by giving you a first dose of Schubert in school. And it is thanks to that first free dose that the French economy now benefits from the 10 euros you just injected into it. At this point, you spot two American tourists who seem a bit lost. They ask for directions to the Sacré-Cœur Church in Montmartre. You answer in English that is quite far away. They smile and compliment you on your colorful accent. You are visibly French, which right away makes you appear interesting and sophisticated. Now, to what do you owe this prestige, if not the hundreds of years of French culture? Great cuisine, the films La Nouvelle Vague, libertine literature. The authors of these creations crafted objects that contributed to the image of France, which you are enjoying today standing here on the Place de la Concorde, without having paid a penny for it. You still don't know it, but you are benefiting from what in economics is called a positive externality. The free market, being unable to take externalities into account, it is the state that has to gauge their importance through public funding. The three of you then take a taxi across town all the way to the freshly refurbished Sacré-Cœur Church. You pay the driver and pick a cafe for the marvelous terrace overlooking the monument, and you spend your evening drinking complicated cocktails. The Tuileries lemonades, the Schubert CD, the taxi, the cocktails. Would you have purchased all of those goods if you hadn't been near public spaces that were worth visiting? By paying the gardeners who maintain the paths of the Tuileries, by widening the pavement of the Concorde, by renovating the roof of the Sacré-Cœur, the state attracted you to these places and triggered purchases that you probably would not have made otherwise. Your money enriched shopkeepers that will in turn use it to purchase goods. This is what is called the multiplier effect of cultural investment. In just half a day, you have illustrated three major economic principles that justify every year spending public funds on culture.
nous attendons.
Well, we are waiting for the person who is going to sum up everything you've seen, heard, listened to. I think he's down in the basement somewhere, coming slowly upstairs. That person is Jean Plantu. But since he's not here yet, I would like to go back to the people who sketched you, especially those who participated in the roundtables of the forum. I've already said this several times, but I'll repeat it for those who might not have been here. If the cartoonists wouldn't like to come down here and stand around me rather than hiding up there. No.
You're not coming to see me. Can the cartoonists join me on the floor, please? Alors, on va.
So we'll start with you because, well, there are many reasons for that, but the first is that you're Tunisian, and you will tell us perhaps just the word. You express yourself, I guess, better with your cats, but I'm sure you could also express yourself in words. I was saying we wouldn't have time to have you come, but since Jean isn't here, you won't be introducing Jean, as we agreed earlier, but you will also introduce your colleagues because some of them only speak Spanish and we don't have any Spanish translation here. Well, a Venezuelan and a Cuban, that's wonderful. So let me introduce a Palestinian cartoonist, Khalil, a Cuban Bodigan, a Venezuelan, Raima, and then Michel Kishka as well, of course, who is with us, and Eliza Donnelly from the United States. And the Cartooning for Peace Forum were a team of cartoonists who make satire and political criticism in our respective countries, and we meet to criticize all the differences and discrimination which may exist in our countries. We are drawing for peace. We're drawing to resist censorship and tyranny. Well, I think that everyone saw just now that a drawing can do a lot more than a text, especially when texts are censored. And you are perhaps in the most complex situation of all, because you're expressing in one word how, both of you in fact, how you try to get a cartoon past the censors and how you avoid going to prison.
But I try to manage this by using some way of self-censorship sometimes, and try to depend on symbols and something implicit that you cannot understand directly. You have to understand it in an indirect way. So it's difficult because there is the Israeli censor and there is a Palestinian censor. Everybody is sensitive from criticism, and caricature is a little bit dangerous than the words. So they are twice sensitive of the cartoons. But anyway, it's our job, it's my job. I got accustomed and I can't live without it.
Un seul mot, bravo.
And a word from Neuza? Well, concerning censorship, I have no past. I'm on my Facebook page or on Twitter. I'm entirely free to publish what I want. And otherwise, I work for Ciné-Mensuel in France, who give me carte blanche. In Tunisia, I don't work for newspapers because they're not independent. They all belong to political parties, and I want to remain free. And to avoid going to prison, I run very fast. Bravo once again.
Bueno, en Venezuela,
In Venezuela, we try to act in such a way that caricature and criticism be a game of intelligence, creativity more and more.
Vous m'entendez? Oui. Rai m'a dit que voilà, au Venezuela, elle essaie justement que la critique soit un jeu.
que la crítica sea
For criticism to be a game of intelligence and uses creativity to try to understand reality and to express it.
Pouvoir traduire la réalité.
gráficamente y
Graphically speaking, and to go above and beyond taboos that exist.
Graphique et pouvoir aller au-delà des tabous.
Et à Cuba?
Bueno,
Well, I am of Cuban origin, but I have spent the last 20 years living and working in Mexico.
Cubaine, mais cela fait 20 ans qu'il habite au Mexique, à Mexico.
trabajo como
And I work as an editorial cartoonist for a daily paper called El Universal.
Il travaille pour le journal mexicain qui s'appelle El Universal.
yo pienso que
I think that censorship and freedom of expression, or the fact that there is not freedom of expression when there is censorship, means that there cannot be full freedom of expression.
La liberté d'expression.
por ejemplo, en México,
For instance, in Mexico, the president in power is basically chosen by business leaders.
Qui est pratiquement élu par les médias, par les entreprises.
entonces es una especie de administración.
And so he's basically an administrator.
Du pouvoir.
Y los problemas de
And the problems of censorship in our periodicals have more to do with the people who pay for advertising in those papers.
Le problème des censures dans les journaux, c'est surtout dû aux entreprises qui payent la publicité qui va apparaître dans les journaux.
que a la vez son quienes
Who are the same people as elect the president.
Ceux qui vont élire le président du pays.
Merci. Mon cher Jean, vous êtes...
Thank you, dear Jean. Here you are. You summed up the whole forum. Off you go. Well, I imagine we haven't a lot of time. No, but we'll have a quick look. But since Khalil and Rama, Nadia, and Baligan are incredible. Well, I mean, have a look at this drawing by Baligan. The drawing talent of this cartoonist that you can often see used in the Courrier International. And it's really Latin American style of drawing. Here we see that this drawing, that's rather nice, isn't it? Is seen through the eyes of a Qatari burqa. So that takes us back to what we talked about yesterday. You don't see a lot, in fact, a woman in a burqa. In any case, it's a very interesting form of drawing, which you'll find in the Courrier International. And from Tunis, you see the same thing. Every Wednesday, we have a page in Le Monde, thanks to our different co-workers there at Le Monde. And you'll be able to see this on the Geo page, the geopolitical page, every Wednesday, the way these extraordinary people draw. And I'd like to thank Nicolas for giving us the opportunity to let these images vibrate within the forum. Quite simply, we all have cells inside our heads, and I'm talking here to filmmakers and painters and architects. They know this. But the first day we spend on this planet after being born, we already have cells which understand not Hebrew or Arabic or French or English, but they understand images. And those images are the things, the stories that we tell one another. And let me pay tribute to the whole technical team of the forum, because it's really exceptionally well done. Let me also thank the interpreters who are doing fabulous work, and I think that you are the people who draw your civil society's interpreters and draw the combats that we are leading. And I will finish here with Nadia to say that we brought together cartoonists from the Maghreb because we don't have enough budget in cartooning for peace. We had the Maghrebian movement, even people from Tripoli in Libya. That's not so easy. We brought them to Tunis a month ago with Algerians and Moroccans and all the Tunisian cartoonists that we had. And we had a meeting, and we'll make a book about this. And we would like to transmit this specific way of looking at things, of all of these impertinent, disturbing cartoonists in the 28 countries of the European Union, which have fallen asleep a bit and which really need to know what's going on in Lampedusa, which isn't an Italian problem or a Tunisian problem. It's a European and an African problem. And if we understand Lampedusa a bit, and if we understand the cartoonists from Maghrebian movement, we'll understand Europe better. Everything we're doing in cartooning for peace is not being done out of generosity or humanity, but out of self-interest. It is in our interest to create these bridges. And Boyan is from Havana, originally from Havana. He's Cuban. And he didn't leave Cuba because he was being muzzled, but rather because he wanted to experience something different in Mexico City, where he doesn't have problems with Fidel Castro, but he does have problems with drug traffickers. It's not as simple as it might appear. Raima has big problems with Radio Menu, which is making a film that you will certainly see at Cannes on cartooning for peace. And they filmed this in Caracas with the team from the radio station and Stephanie Valrato. They filmed the building of this combat led by Latin American cartoonists in a country where Raima is constantly being attacked and harassed, no longer by Hugo Chavez's government, but now by President Maduro's government, which continues to harass her on television, which tells her names, details of her private life, and in a city like Caracas where violence is terrible. And so from time to time, when she goes to the courthouse, she wonders if she doesn't need to have a bodyguard. And Liza Donnelly comes here every year. You know her already. And she comes to make drawings for cartoons for the Avenue Forum, but she's also here to build this bridge with her friend Khalil, who is also here. And in general, they kiss one another on the lips. No, not really. But it's so moving to see them both here. Even to have a 5, 6, 7-hour plane trip together. They don't live in the same place at all. And it's thanks to being on an airplane that they managed to exchange their ideas on liberty of thought and freedom of thought. And I would also say, I did think of you here, Nicolas. This was, where did I have that drawing? Let me see. There's a drawing I really like, this one, because you would think of it, Nicolas Seydoux, perhaps, but in any case, I wanted to pay this tribute to you, because if you brought us together, it's because we believe in you. We believe a lot in computer science. We believe in Facebook. We believe in the impertinence of social networks. But believing in you is already believing in a future of images and of correspondence between all forms of art. And we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for this vibrant moment that we spend together.
Well,
that applause is not addressed to me, but to the whole forum team. And Kaltenbach, Olivier Leguet. It's addressed, and I will certainly forget one or two people, to all the moderators, including you, Jean, who were one of the most brilliant of all, but Denise Bombardier, who is still here, Ita Garam, Olivier Pauvre-Davor, Henri Gagnon, Blanche-Neige, Snow White, Monique Cantos-Berber, and obviously Pierre Lescure. I heard his interesting laugh just now. But the people I think we need to applaud the most were the ones who dreamed of asking questions and weren't able to do so, or those who asked questions but obviously didn't have the answer that they were hoping for. And I would ask you to applaud all of them because I wouldn't like them to leave this place feeling too frustrated. I also mentioned our partners at the entrance, so I won't mention that again, but there was one person who was working in the shadow in a particularly marvelous way. That was Catherine Kahn from Publicis, and I really wanted to thank her now. So, well, waiting for the ministers, we will straight away. Well, here you are. You're coming, you're going. I really don't see what I have left to do here. That's quite marvelous. So you see at what point it is useless to applaud because I am here for nothing. I'm just a loyal foot soldier standing here. And the ministers will be here in about a quarter of an hour. And while waiting for them, Michelangelo Pistoletto and Christophe Ono-dit-Biot will not conclude because how could there be conclusions? But the perspectives on what power should be granted to culture. That's an enormous subject. And let me reassure you that you will still not have answers to your questions. You have the floor, however.
Bonjour, on va essayer de donner...
Hello, thank you very much for giving us some answers, dear Michelangelo. I wanted to say, first of all, hello to everyone, and to say that on behalf of Le Point, my magazine, I'm very happy to have the honor to moderate. As we say, I love that word moderate because it suggests there's enthusiasm and things overflowing and lots of life, and we love it when things are lively. So I'm moderating this closing session in a sober but ambitious way. It's entitled Perspectives, What Power Should Be Granted to Culture. Let me introduce you to my first guest, Michelangelo Pistoletto, who has gotten the premium prize. That's practically a Nobel Prize for art. One of our greatest artists. You've been able to see his work distributed throughout the world, but especially in the Louvre. That ended up in September, I think the last 6 months of the year. The Louvre, on that occasion, put a strange symbol on the pyramid, and you'll be telling us about that, Michelangelo. It's a sort of sign that looks like the mathematical sign for infinity, but with a third loop in the middle, and we'll come back to that. Now, Pistoletto is one of our greatest artists, and he's one of the rare artists to think that art not only can, but should change the world, rather than changing the artist's bank account. Pistoletto is an Italian who believes in heaven. He has systematized that belief in his manifesto book called The Third Paradise, Third Form of Heaven. He's also an artist who makes the spectator a protagonist of his work because in 1962, I think he already started with painting mirror. You have a stainless steel plaque which has been polished so that it will reflect. And on that you have a screen printing of an image so that when the spectator comes closer, his or her reflection becomes part of this mirror painting. Am I saying too many foolish and silly things? Take the microphone, because if I say anything wrong, you have to correct me right away. And then we'll have Overleaf who will be arriving in 10 or 15 minutes, who's at the prefecture right now, but will be coming to join us. So first of all, a word or two on what the perspectives we find in the title. It's a very important technique, which was very important right here at the Palais des Papes. Many frescoes show that. But it's not just a technique perspective, it's also a path. And I'm thinking first of the Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg. You walk on that. We use the word perspective and not prospect in French. And I think it also gives you two qualities of the artist, said by Diderot, which were the morals and the perspective. And I think this is something quite fundamental. We put things in perspective, we give them a greater field, and we give them a future. And what are these things? These are the things that we've heard about all through these 3 days of this forum on culture. We heard about the culture as a weapon for peace, stopping the world from falling apart, as Camus said. There were also 3 days in which we talked quite a lot about Europe and identity. Culture is what we are, and I think we'll remember for a long time Abdulaziz Mbai's proverb, his Minister of Culture of Senegal, it's not because you put a bit of wood in the water that it will turn into a crocodile. We will also remember a whole performance around one word, jouir in France, which is to enjoy, to take advantage of, to have pleasure in. And we'll also remember a performance by the idea of having a ministry of spirit, ministry of thought. That was a wonderful idea. And time for thinking, thinking for time. There was also an idea in politics that we'll be talking about with Aurélie Filippetti, the idea of putting a philosopher near the prince to inject culture along with technical matters and to optimize culture and not just budgets. We were talking about youth, of love, of Erasmus, both a scholar and the scholarship, and there are many different subjects because this Avignon Forum was also asking a question about many forms of uncertainty in a world which is changing, sliding, slipping, becoming ever more digital. We saw this with the hackathon for the best and for the worst when it's dominated by monopolistic platforms, a time of questioning. In a time when black gold is called data, in the space of 24 hours, 4.5 billion internet or Google searches, 5,000 hours of links put on YouTube, 400 million tweets are posted, and 2.5 trillion bits of data are generated. So this is a whole mountain of data points which are a gold mine for people who know how to process that kind of information. We also talked about Europeans, men and women, come out of different phenomena where people are turning back on themselves, and we'll talk about that together with the minister. But first of all, I shall turn to Michelangelo Pistoletta. First question. So you want to change the world, you say this. And what is that third paradise, that third form of heaven you promise us? Well, the third paradise is a symbol. It's a symbol which opens a vision to us. You talked about perspective. We come from perspective. In our old Europe, it comes from Florence, basically. And today, we're once again at the center of Europe, right here, at Avignon, in a very strong symbol, this place. And today, we're working with Mr. Barroso on a new narrative for Europe. Now, what does that mean, a new narrative for Europe? It means that we are looking for a relationship between old forms of perspective that were born in Europe and new perspectives which perhaps we are getting ready to start up right here. So what is that new perspective that's getting started? Well, you know, I created that sign. Artists are symbolic. We had lots of drawings here, and they were all highly symbolic. There you go. Now you can see your symbol here. Even caricatures and cartoons are symbolic. It's an expression that art can give to the world. That's a symbol. And you talked about mirrors. My starting point in the 1960s was the transformation of the canvas into a mirror. I made a self-portrait. I looked for my own identity, but in looking for my own identity, I used a mirror, which was next to the canvas. And then finally, I wasn't happy to see that the reality in the mirror was always different than my interpretation of it. I saw Pistoletta, but I needed to transport that Pistoletta that I saw in the mirror to myself and from myself to the canvas. And at the end of the day, I said, well, why not put the canvas in place of the mirror and vice versa? And that was when my self-portrait became a self-portrait of the world. Everyone was able to be part of this with their own image in that picture. So the picture was a virtual space, obviously. So is internet. And I could say here that a mirror is like an enunciation of what internet might have been, technically and practically speaking. Well, very often we talk about internet narcissism. Data's, Facebook, like big narcissistic machines. And here, once again, we have the idea of a mirror and of sending a picture. Well, it's the mirror of the world. What happens in a mirror? One sees oneself, but you also see the people who are standing next to you, and also people who are very far away, who might come closer tomorrow. At the same time, as you see here, yourself, someone else can see themselves in a mirror. Well, you're talking about mirrors, which is fine, but I don't see about, okay, you talk about heaven and mirrors. Where do we go from here? I want to know more about heaven. Well, I started with mirrors so that I could tell you how a new dynamic has become present in artworks, and that's the dynamic of the presence of the spectator. At the same time, the desire to take what a picture proposes to you and put it to work, a relationship between the artist and the world. So I turned toward our audience and said, with the eyes I have behind my head, I'm looking in the mirror, and I'm entering into the world in which these people exist, into their lives. And the more I do that, the deeper I go into the mirror via my reflection. And it's that way of being involved with the world that leads me to think that art must take a basic responsibility on board. And here, I think that I can share that vision, which is a new perspective, which goes back not just to the Renaissance, but even further back than that, the first heaven, the first paradise, that was man in a state of nature. The time in which people were entirely try to say it in Italian if you can't find the word in French. Entirely involved, in harmony with nature. And the second was an artificial paradise. That's the apple that you saw. That's quite interesting. We'll talk about that. But the first paradise was the Garden of Eden, was the apple, and someone bit into the apple. And that biting into the apple meant human beings' detachment from nature and from the garden, because the word paradise means sheltered garden in Old Persian. So today, if we have a look, for instance, at apple, apple symbol is that, an apple that's been bitten into. That also means knowledge, right? Yes, it's knowledge, but at the same time, it's the artificial world, which means it's the second paradise, the artificial world. So you have the apple, the world of knowledge, the garden, that's the first paradise, and then we have the second one where we've been detached from nature, and we've created apple. Not the apple, but apple, which is also a symbol. And it's not just a coincidence that they chose that symbol, which comes from liturgy, from the church, and so forth. It's not just a coincidence. So they did that. But in the second paradise, well, that's what we're talking about now. And that's big data, metadata, yeah. But I think that we must consider that alongside the wonderful things we've created with new technologies, we are also destroying the world at the same time. Now, why do you say that? Humanity is in deep crisis. And that's why I think that, and this is the third paradise, the perspective on the future is that of putting together a harmonized world where harmony and artifice live together. Well, you're talking about a new renaissance without which you say humanity has only a slim chance of surviving for any time. So the idea here is to help us to survive, no more, no less. Yes, for me, culture, as you've understood, is part of art. And modern art in the 20th century became autonomous from any form of representation. Before that, art told stories of a religious nature or about power or about the people, the great myths, and so forth. But today, these images of the past need to break away from the present and head for the future. And that's what the third paradise needs to do. If we cannot manage to put together a balance between nature and artifice, you can't be optimistic all the time. Well, if you say if there is no culture, humanity risks not surviving, destroying itself. Well, that's what I'm saying. Art freed itself. It became totally emancipated and autonomous. And with that autonomy, it also took on as much responsibility as possible. The more autonomous you are, the more free you are, the more responsible you have to become. There is no responsibility without freedom, but also vice versa. So art, I think, is the freest element that we can find in all of our systems of common or shared life, and it's with that freedom or liberty that this third paradise appears as the future of responsibility, because art is what is going to create responsibility through freedom, because freedom all alone is not worth anything. So what is the responsibility of art and artists? Responsibility, that seems terrifying. Art is freedom. It's pushing boundaries further. It's the idea of not being responsible. No, it's just the opposite. The freer you are, the more responsible you are. Someone who runs any organization is freer because they have the possibility of deciding, but they're also more responsible. And at the summit of all that responsibility, you find art. So art has to be the new starting point for having as much freedom and responsibility as possible. And all of that is true in all areas of social life, be it economics, politics, communications, anything. Artists have to be able to give to each and every one of us a bit more freedom, and at the same time, the responsibility for that freedom. So freedom, responsibility, art, for you, culture is art. The idea is to make us freer and more responsible. Yes, but freedom without responsibility is worthless. Because you don't just, well, listen, the first paradise is the paradise of ignorance. The second paradise is the paradise of knowledge. And now, with knowledge, we're going on to the paradise of responsibility. So it's ethical art, basically, especially in the Greek sense. Aesthetics for ethics and vice versa. So you have aesthetic. You could have a merger of ethics and aesthetics. So you're not just making artworks, you're making little cities. I'm thinking of the art city you created in a former textile factory in Biella in Piedmont, which is, I believe, your hometown. And now there's a foundation there. And I'd like you to tell us a bit about how that works, where you have all different responsibilities: economics, sociology, politics, fashion, spirituality. I believe religion is also involved, resonate with one another. And you had that phrase, which actually I found very striking, a bit shocking. But you'll explain it to me, because I think it's quite central when we talk about the power of culture. So you shouldn't just have to pay to go into a museum, but art should also be useful. Useful for what? Well, I've just said that. But to be responsible and useful, that means that with the Città dell'Arte, I didn't remain in a virtual dimension. With the Città dell'Arte, I have created a sort of institution, which is new. Because in the 1960s, in the mid-60s, we demonstrated in the streets. 1968 was people demonstrating in the street, demanding freedom in society. And logos everywhere, not that logo. Make love, not war, for instance. But after that, politics came back, and there was a disaster. That's a città dell'arte? No, that's something else. That is participation. Because December 20th, the day of the end of the world, you know, that had been widely announced last year, that the world was going to end that day. We created the beginning, the Renaissance, a rebirth day. And so it was a holiday that everyone could participate in. And with that participation, we take responsibility. We put ourselves in an artistic situation, which means that major artworks can be created for the whole world, all of us together. And it's a big party. It's not just a party or a holiday in itself, but it has a very strong meaning. Everyone shoulders a part of that transformation. It's no longer something that comes from the top down, but from the bottom up. It comes from each and every one of us. And we need to think that to create society, we need to be at least 2 people, and then 4, and then 8, and then society is made by a whole quantity of people.
Bonjour.
Hello. And now with Michelangelo Pistoletto. Well, we started off with Michelangelo Pistoletto, and now we have someone else. Her name is Aurélie Filippetti. She holds a degree in literature or philosophy, and she also wrote a paper entitled The Last Days of the Working Class. Well, Aurélie Filippetti, I believe, is also a Minister of Culture, so that should make her competent to discuss culture. She believes that culture is not just good for art, but as an engine for growth. And here at Avignon, we talked about culture as a source of hope, but we have all sorts of questions and challenges about, well, we're challenging the power of not just the state, the power of culture. And let me put it to you, Madam Minister, I said that earlier, is it the case that the state still sort of wields power over state? Is this desirable? Is this something that we want? And then, of course, you feel free to answer every which way, but in a global context, how can you act? I mean, yesterday you said in a world where big cultural platforms are American and China will spend billions of yuan to roll out its soft power. Now, how do you do? We caught between the two. What should France do? What should Europe do? How can we develop our own power? And does the state have any power at all over culture? And now, Madam Minister, your microphone isn't working, is it? Yes, it is. Well, we don't propose to have power over culture. What we are trying to do here is to help culture blossom out in various directions, but we have a regulatory role to make sure that culture can exist, but also some sort of safeguards should be there to make sure that culture can express itself and can find a sort of a breeding ground to enable creators to express themselves. I mean, we can help that. Regulators can help that happen. And of course, in a democratic society, it is not for us to dictate what artists should write or draw or whatever. Now, of course, in France, the state has always been a lover of culture, and that dates back many, many years, way much long before the present political system. And the purpose of this meeting is to discuss the powers of culture, but also the power with a capital P of culture, because there's never been any civilization worthy of its salt that didn't have culture at its foundation, and the traces left by such civilizations are always cultural traces, and the role of the state, and indeed the role here in France, the role of the European Union, is to claim what we call cultural exception, but see this as a tool of modernity to make sure that there could be some economic regulation of culture to make it escape the invisible hand of the market. Well, this is in line with what Michelangelo Pistoletto just said, art as a tool of responsibility. Well, yes, but then the state has another role to play. The role it has to guarantee equality between citizens, between territories, and the role of the state is not to organize, say, a centralized cultural policy. It is for the state to ensure that there shouldn't be even greater divides than already exist. Unfortunately, we know that there are inequalities in the way in which the cultural heritage is transmitted. It is for the state to make it possible for creators, for artists to emerge, whichever their discipline. But this means that we have to make it possible. We have to make it possible for every child to get the right education. And so that means at a very early stage, finding those children who do have a love for art and have a talent, and make it possible for them to fulfill their artistic potential. And the artist is now devoid of a microphone. So imagine here we have a state who is, which is sort of trying to promote the artistic inclinations and proclivities of its citizens. Well, you talk about the state, but look here, I'm Italian, and in my country, my state begins with Europe. I mean, we talk about culture, but hey, culture is something that should move freely and create new relationships between existing traditions, between traditions of different countries. Don't you think that is one of the roles of the state? Well, yesterday, you may remember this young Swede. Oh, hang on. Michelangelo just said something. There's one thing. When we talk about the state, it's all very well, but we could simply say political authority. Is there any kind of cultural legitimacy of the political authority? I mean, in Italy, during the Quattrocento, or right now the European Union, how legitimate is, well, what's the cultural legitimacy of political authority? I don't think it is there to wield power over culture, but to make it possible for culture to blossom out. Well, but you're right. There is something of a contradiction there, isn't there, between power on the one hand and culture on the other, and just as well, because of course culture has always been something of a counter power. Well, yes, but isn't it the case that the princes have always been the sponsors of art? Well, yes, but still, nonetheless, the art has not always sent back sort of a very positive picture of the state, even though the state may have been subsidizing it. Well, the time is not here for us to criticize and be against. The time has come for us to propose something positive. Were you there yesterday? A Swedish man said that you were beautiful, and that's a nice thing. Oh, hang on, there were three of us. He said all three of us, and I don't know whether he said the beauty was the fact that they were diverse, because there were three different ministers, and he thought that was no, the three beauties, the three graces. Well, okay, that's all very well, but then he said, I feel a citizen of a global world rather than a citizen of Sweden or the European Union. So why do you talk about a cultural Europe? I mean, it is true. This is a global globalized world where platforms are American, where all of us go from one country to the next, and how do we, I mean, is there such a thing as a European culture, a European attitude? I mean, that was what Michelangelo just asked just now. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe Madam Minister can help us address this. I mean, she can be. She can take the voice of culture, and I will take that of the politician. Well, look. It is not for Europe to put its citizens under identity house arrest. We're not trying to establish a sort of identity card of the European citizen. In fact, it is for us to be able to transcend our own borders, to transcend our own national, local, or regional identities. It is for us to reach out to others, and that is lovely. But at the same time, this takes place within the individuality of artists. It is precisely because artists are very individual. They know who they are, and they are just themselves. They cannot sort of embrace a sort of multinational identity. They are very singular, but starting from that, they can be open to the rest of the world, and that makes a culture worthwhile, and that is the ambitious project that we should have. I mean, for me, a cultural Europe, it doesn't mean a European culture, as if. I mean, that would be of course the big pitfall. No, we create a European space conducive to the development of culture. Well, this is all the more important because between Europe and America now you have systems, you have new, say, technological and scientific systems that are connecting up the world, and then it's. We may lose any kind of singularity. I mean, of course, that brings about new advantages, communication, connectivity, and all that. That's all very well. But there's a price to pay for that, isn't there? And initially, it starts off as a crisis because although the benefits may come later on, here, what we can feel in economic and political terms, we can feel the crisis. And I'm sorry to say, we all can also feel it in cultural terms. So, maybe we will grow out of this, but you have to realize that, say, everybody wants to be present around the world, but if you have a situation where everybody wants to be present and you want everybody to be consumers of goods around the world. I mean, you have a situation where everybody consumes the same things, and by the way, in forcing this sort of all-out consumption of the world, that's no good at all. In any case, well, and that precisely is what I talked about responsibility. That yes, let me explain, Aurélie. Michelangelo said lots of things about responsibility. Well, look, I mean, it is true that in some parts of the world here, in the Western world, we've achieved all sorts of freedoms, and that other parts of the world are now only just discovering. And of course, Asia, for instance, is gaining some form of economic freedom that they didn't have. But I mean, then they should take the responsibility that goes with it, shouldn't it? Well, Madam Minister, talking about China and soft power is a clearly stated political ambition. I mean, they call it something else. I don't speak Chinese, but they have a way in Chinese to say soft power, and they use Confucius to disseminate the Chinese language, and they're going to have a museum of African culture, but it will be run by or built by China. Now, what can we Europeans do to try and build our own culture, this cultural space, this European space for cultural creation in which children can learn from Michelangelo through education programs. They can learn from such artists as him in a situation where, well, you have these big cultural platforms such as, Google, Facebook, Twitter. These are these are American platforms. What can Europe do? Is there any... Well, don't forget that Europe is where creation originates, and that is where, well, in the 5th century before the Common Era, this is where the city was built. That's where democracy was born. This is where the whole where the very concept of cultural creativity was born. And so out of that cradle we were born, and we shouldn't be ashamed of our heritage today in Europe. I mean, we remain a cultural force. We have great creative power, and many artists have been, as I said, blossoming from Europe, and many artists have been coming to Europe. Well, China is no place for artistic creation. Ai Weiwei now lives in Berlin. His works were exhibited at the Venice Biennale, but he can't express himself in China, can he? And it's the case for many artists who cannot express themselves in their own countries. And so, of course, artists often have ways and means to circumvent these restrictions, but and they can come to France. But I think the great thing is that Europe should embody that kind of freedom, should epitomize the freedom of creation. Of course, now, of course, the big challenge is that we have these major oligopolies of the internet with Google and whatnot, and we should be proud of our difference, of our specificity. What makes us different and what gives us a chance to survive is that we do have cultural industries, we do produce content, we do have artists, we do have creators, and so what we need to do is to reaffirm the need for us to be preeminent. I don't like the word, but we have to be at the forefront of creation of content. I mean, and we are in a situation where we can represent the world. We can, and we shouldn't have modes of consumption imposed upon us that would sort of standardize the way in which things work. And indeed, that's why France fought so bitterly for cultural exception back in May. That is the ability for us to take on board digital players in that sphere of cultural exception. That is what we achieved in May. We're not saying that we want to enable European artists to be distributed on radio channels. That wasn't the point. The idea was that to make sure that this this uniqueness can exist and can find a platform of its own and shouldn't be simply wiped out by, say, American platforms in which we would have no existence. But in fact, I don't believe culture is sort of a soft power. There's something very fundamental about the power of culture in its ability to represent the world. I mean, it's not just a depiction of the world. It is the meaning we give to the world. That's how we interpret the world. I mean, that's what culture is all about. And that's what cultural agents do. But you have American search engines that will, of course, give preference to American artists. What do you do? I mean, if we're completely overwhelmed by that, well, somehow we still have to fight tooth and nail for cultural diversity. And I mean, there's a convention on cultural diversity. It dates back to 2005. That has got to be adjusted to take on board the digital era. And this is not just for French or indeed European artists. The countries around the world share our views. Well, the digital era is all very well, but you have to to see how the digital era translates into everyday life. I mean, that is the essential thing. I mean, to see how what difference it will make to the way we live every day. And that means that we have to find local sort of material solutions. I mean, look, somebody living in the countryside and producing goods from the farm. I mean, how can I mean, this sort of, I mean, it starts with the food, but it could be, it seems very basic, but I mean, for small things already, you should be able to defend your identity, because big things are the result of very small things adding up. And so, and that is how democracy works. It has to be a bottom-up thing where everybody participates with their small little bits coming together, lest they might be washed over by a wave of standardization. So, as I said, daily life, and of course, it is for politicians or for the political system to make that happen in a coordinated way, make it possible for, say, educated people to have a say and maybe guide policies, because it's not just politicians guiding the people, leading the people. It is for the people very much, well, to be freer but more responsible, to be in charge. But that means, of course, providing some form of education. Madam Minister, you talked about Greece, cradle of democracy, but Greece is now facing the rise of fascism, isn't it? With the Golden Dawn, huh? And so, is it not for culture to try and pacify tensions? I mean, because when it's instrumentalized, it turns into fascism. Well, it's not just in Greece, by the way. We have to put our own house in order. In France, we do have, if you look at the National Front today, they are on the rise too. So we cannot very well sort of give lessons. When we have to fight extremism, well, of course, culture is at the forefront of that fight, because, of course, the culture has always been the prime target, in fact, of extremism. You've always burned books and yeah, but look, here we are in the Palace of the Popes in Avignon, so you have to. Well, no, precisely because we are here, we talk about the way in which politicians and well, the political and religious power has always sort of tried to subjugate the world, and we've got the same medieval situation here, coming maybe from other religions. But in any event, I mean, but of course, there's always a sort of a business model that takes advantage of that situation. I mean, it's not just a social thing, but there is some economic advantage and some political advantage to be derived from that situation. And so religion is very useful to create problems that in turn can be very beneficial to very small groups around the world. But they can, as I said, I know how to capitalize on that and how to use digital technologies to their dark ends. Yes, look, extremist movements tend to confuse two things. The fact that art is unique. Any artist is unique, but doesn't mean, just because it is unique doesn't mean it's elitist. And indeed, that's the myth, and the myth that's got to be dismantled. Just because an artist is demanding, and just because an artist is unique, doesn't mean he or she speaks out to the rest of the world. No, but elitism, you use the word, but when we want to define culture, we're saying that it's the loftiest ideals accessible to the rest of the world. Well, yes, and that's probably the best definition, because the idea is to make quality, I mean, the highest possible quality, but high quality means that for that to happen, for the highest quality works to blossom out, as we said, well, we have to create a system conducive for that to happen in terms of regulation and whatnot. Now, this may sound utopian, but we do need some sort of mad hope or some vision, some utopian vision to get anywhere. I mean, and not just for the lucky few, but for, I mean, make art accessible to all. Well, look, you may remember that there was a time when artists were at the vanguard of Europe and the United States, and that was that. But now you have art academies around the world, and youngsters learning to be individuals, learning to have an individual expression. So there's not like a sort of a vanguard of front runners dominating the rest. I mean, now each and every individual can mobilize and harness his and her own capacities, and also use technologies and whatnot to communicate with the rest of the world. And they take everything on board to express their own individuality. So when you say create a climate conducive for things to happen, well, sometimes you say a political message or political systems or something. This may be difficult to understand for the man on the street. Maybe art can make it more accessible. Look, you're talking about complicated things. Let's take a breather now and bring in the youth. Yesterday we discussed Erasmus, and Erasmus seems to have been the only program that made it possible for young people to understand there was such a thing as Europe with many different countries in it. In the 18th century, there was this thing called the Grand Tour. When a student graduated from high school, they went around Europe to discover countries with their civilizations, architectures, languages, civilizations, etc. But Madam Minister, surely we could imagine something that we should go beyond Erasmus. This sort of grand tour, where a universal student, a European student, and it's not just Europe. It could be very something for all students around the world. Some kind of grand tour enabling somebody who just graduated from school. I mean, of course, that would cost lots of money, so you have to bankroll these lucky students, but make it possible for them to discover artistic expressions from around the world. They could go to Michelangelo's Città dell'Arte. Yes, well, in fact, we have artists coming from around the world who come and stay with us from all around the world, all different languages, cultures, and it's quite interesting, by the way, to see how together they're creating this new society of exchange. I mean, at the end, they all love one another, and they do work together, and it's a remarkable experiment. You see it work before your eyes, and you really are talking about artists from different walks of lives and horizons and cultures, and that used not to exist at all. And we're really creating. I mean, it's experimental, but you can see how a positive society can be born out of diversity. Well, that's very exciting for young men. I mean, imagine that sort of grand tour, 19th century style or 18th century style even. Yes, and it shouldn't just be for artists, budding artists. I mean, really, in an ideal world, every young person should get a chance to be exposed. But what I'm saying is artists can make this sort of thing understandable, or it can facilitate access to other cultures. I mean, isn't art a way? Well, the idea is to take a step back. I mean, normally you live within a given cycle. You have pathways that have been clearly drawn for, and sometimes for the younger generation, this can be quite daunting. You say, well, the road is, I mean, the path is clear. You know where to go, but very often you have a clear path to a wall. You end up nowhere at all. You may have a degree that's not worth the paper it's printed on, and then you are out of school and out of work. So the concept is, and if you look at great art revolutions or great shocks, never happen linearly. You at some point there's a departure, some sort of artistic breakthrough. I like the word. I mean, you use the word rupture, and you said in 30 years ago you said you step back. Pas de côté, and it's not step backing. It's not stepping back. It's stepping aside, and that's what the torero does in a bullfight. The bullfighter steps aside to let the bull stampede on. Next to him, but the movement of the bullfighter is very graceful. I'm against killing the bull, by the way. I mean, but the stepping aside, letting that movement go by, and then make it possible to take another look at the world. Now, that is the way in which democracy can be promoted, making it possible to step aside and maybe step into Michelangelo's Città dell'Arte. Michelangelo, you'll cook some risotto for us, won't you? God, I will. But I would like to teach everybody to know how to create this sign for infinity. It's a single line. It looks like an upside down or an 8 on its side, but it's not just an 8. You have a third loop, and that third loop is that third heaven, that third paradise. So a step aside to heaven. Well, thank you so much, Madam Minister and Michelangelo Pistoletto.
Un immense merci. Je remets officiellement.
Thank you. And it is now for me to present the Minister of Culture with the declaration of the Forum on the rights of web surfers, the rights of the creator, and intellectual property rights, because there can be no culture without intellectual property rights. But I believe that next year we will certainly take your cue and say that reform can only happen through and with culture. I mean, Minister, you said something wonderful. You need a bit. You need to be utopian, and the world lacks this sorely. But China is utopian, even though it is not the best of all worlds. You have a bit of that, and if not all of us started off from a good spot, we can certainly make a difference. So, in any case, we hope next year you'll be able to stay with us longer and speak longer. And for all of you, your only mission, if you accept it, is to hurry and catch the train. Hurry, take your suitcases, take your clothes, get on board the train, and get out of here.
Voilà, je vous remets officiellement ce texte qui a un immense avantage, c'est qu'il est très clair.